Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Russian President Vladimir Putin has suspended the New START treaty with the US, saying the strategic systems have been put on the combat duty, threatening at the same time of the resumption of the nuclear testing. At the same time, the United States Secretary of State, Mr. Antony Blinken, has called it deeply unfortunate and irresponsible, at the same time saying that the US was willing to talk with Russia on the issue. On the other hand, we have seen that NATO's chief, Jens Stoltenberg, along with EU's top diplomat and the foreign minister of Ukraine, told a news conference that more nuclear arms with less arms control is going to make the world more a dangerous place. We also saw that Kremlin spokesperson has said everything will depend on the attitude of the Western countries if they want Russia to return to the compliance of this particular treaty. However, we have seen that Russian foreign ministry has said that Russia will continue to comply with the rules of the nuclear missile carriers that can be deployed until the expiry of the treaty in 2026. Now, this particular treaty is one of the last major arms control treaties between the US and Russia. It was signed back in 2010, and when it took effect, the then US Secretary of State, Ms. Hillary Clinton, said something. Let me quote. When it comes to the button that has worried us the most over the years, the one that would unleash destruction, today we take another step to ensure it will never be pushed, unquote. Now, after the suspension of this particular treaty between the US and Russia, this decision, of course, by the Russian president, which has been endorsed by the lower house of the parliament in Russia, the State Duma also, what are going to be the possible implications, and how serious has that threat of pushing the nuclear button, which was referred to by Ms. Hillary Clinton, has become after this suspension? Let me bring in our panelists. We are honored to have been joined in the studio by Dr. Adil Sultan. He is Dean, Head of the Department of Strategic Studies, Air University. Dr. Sultan, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And in the studio, we're also honored to have been joined by Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi, his former permanent representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Mr. Naqvi, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. On Skype at the same time from Paris, France, we are being joined by Mr. Karel. He's political analyst associated with Schiller Institute. Mr. Vereycken, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Now, Dr. Sultan, this move of suspension of the last major arms control treaty with the US, what do you think? Is it a daring move at this point in history when there are already so many tensions between the US and Russia?
I see it as very disturbing and serious move. It's a win for the military-industrial complex in the United States also. They had been pushing the administration to be more tough against President Putin. I think the overall intent of this move or this approach towards Putin was to incite Putin to take certain action, such as this one, and then to project Putin as a bad guy, and then justify whatever arms development they want to build the United States.
Right. Mr. Naqvi, your take regarding this. How do you see this move?
Well, this move should be seen in the context of the evolution or the kind of decline of the old arms control regime, which meant, the NPT, the various nuclear safety, the Convention on Nuclear Safety, and then the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, and the whole structure of limiting nuclear weapons and their use as much as possible. In line with that entire set of agreements was the attitude of the leaders of the two major powers, the Americans, the United States and the Soviet Union, and then later Russia. Both were aiming to limit the further development of nuclear weapons. Start was the treaty that led to this, and there's a whole story behind it. There was Paul Nietzsche, the American arms control expert, and the famous walk in the woods, when he walked with the Russian representative and they decided on this and it moved forward. Reagan and Gorbachev worked out the first arms control start between the two countries and on that. So I don't want to go in any length in this because there is a lot of history behind it. However, this whole thing started collapsing in the last this decade of 2020. Before that, it was in limbo for some time, and then it started collapsing. And we now see this total disruption of the process of greater arms control, which had set in.
But back in 2010, Mr. Naqvi, there was, of course, that willingness, that sort of a consensus between Russia and the US, that they struck this particular treaty back in 2010. And then there was another, it was reviewed and renewed last year in 2021, 2 years back, after it was expired, after its 10-year period. So it shows that there was willingness on both the sides.
Yes, and they both seem to agree to take further steps towards limiting nuclear arms. However, the Russia-Ukraine war, when Russia led a military offensive against Ukraine last year, was the tipping point, I think, where now the Russian leadership was not inclined to move forward on arms control with the United States. And the bilateral context of this whole situation between the US and Russia is very important. According to what happens there, the rest of the world also follows suit. So Pakistan, to just conclude what I'm saying, is not in favor of any sort of inappropriate or unlikely scenario of controlling and then not abiding by it.
Right.
We abide by our commitments. We are not signatories of the NPT. We are not signatories of the CTBT, and we are not signatories of many other, but we are signatories of all the safety and security conventions of the United Nations. So the point is that it is regrettable, because this means that the world has become a more dangerous place, and that is what Jens Stoltenberg has said.
Right.
And we have to now see how badly this will affect international security.
Right. Let me bring in Mr. Vereycken into the discussion also. Mr. Vereycken, what reasons do you think have led the Russian president to suspend this, the only last major arms treaty with the US?
Well, first of all, I think it is a general expression of the breakdown of mutual trust, and then I would say this is only a reflection of this breakdown. And this trust has been severely being destroyed, first of all, by the declarations of Mrs. Merkel and Hollande, who said that they did the Minsk Treaty not to have peace in Ukraine, but to leave time to Ukraine to arm and to prepare for a war. The second point, of course, is the recent destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, with the revelation of Simon Hirsch, it becomes clear that this has been done by the United States. So the Russians see that they have no partners for peace anymore in the West. And then also I think it could have been much worse. They could have pulled out the nuclear equipment out of the silos. They didn't do that. They only acted what has been a reaction to what happened last year. If you take the history of the treaty as such, it was on August 8th last year that the US put visas, they started refusing visas to Russian inspectors, which in the framework of the New START treaty, normally there are about 20 visits from each side in the partners' nuclear equipment in the naval and air bases. Now, by the sanctions, the Russians were absolutely prevented to go and to do their work as inspectors in the American military bases. So then,
Mr. Vereycken, I beg your pardon for the interruption. After that move by the US, so this particular move by the Russian president, wasn't it a writing on the wall already, or wasn't it imminent already?
Yes, it was, because already last year on August 8th, the Russians, they excluded the Russian bases for American inspections. So, but they were saying, we don't want to leave this treaty. If you give us the visas for the Russian inspectors, we are ready to respect the treaty. So now this is not being done at all. There's no willingness to have a diplomatic solution to the crisis. The security interests of Russia are not even discussed or taken into account. So the Russians are saying, well, if you want a new arms race, we can go there. That's not yet decided, but now it's open. And especially what I think is very dangerous, that since 2010, there have been 25,000 notifications of mutual movements with nuclear weapons and maneuvers. So this now will stop. And many wars happen by errors of information and misinterpretation. And the breakdown of trust means there are less channels to talk and to prevent that errors will go to the worst crisis.
Right, Dr. Sultan, as Mr. Vereycken has said, there was a move earlier made by the US which actually prompted the Russians to go to make this move.
Definitely, since the invasion of Ukraine, there had been certain steps which the Russian president had been warning the United States and its NATO partners not to push Russia beyond a certain limit, because President Putin also wants to demonstrate that he is a strong man and he is the leader of a resurging Russia. But I think he has still kept the options open to revert to this treaty, because he could have terminated this treaty, but the suspension means there is still room for some dialogue with the United States and other parties over there. But my fear is, or my sense is, this was orchestrated to push President Putin to take certain action and then justify whatever US would do in the future. And I agree with the guest who was speaking. This is going to lead to an arms race. And the difficult thing or the dangerous thing is this arms race may not be bilateral between Russia and United States. Russian president has already indicated that he would also be interested in looking what France and UK are doing, because they see NATO partners and United States as a collective front and as a precondition for re-engaging in this kind of a dialogue. Likewise, United States during Trump era had been hinting that any future treaty, arms control treaty, should also include China. So this is going to complicate future arms control processes. This was one of the symbolic treaty, at least both sides were respecting, and there was a ray of hope that it would at least cap the ongoing arms race. But with the abrogation or the suspension of this treaty, I think now the hawks on all sides, they would have free hand, and there is likely to be an arms race, and which would have effect globally also and in our part of the world also, because our neighbor, we already know that it is building nuclear weapons by justifying that it is against China. Now, if there are no arms control arrangements between the global powers, the smaller powers or the middle powers, they will also take a cover and build justifications to continue development. So that indirectly is likely to affect Pakistan also in the future. So that is why this was something, an arrangement was there which had provided some positive momentum. You also rightly mentioned about 2001 extension of, but if you recall, this was very reluctant extension of New START treaty because there were pressures from within the United States administration or the hawks on the Congress not to extend this treaty. But eventually they thought it's in the US interest also, so they extended it. Now we don't know. The way US is posturing, it is President Biden's visit to Ukraine. Now that's also very symbolic that they want to build that kind of a posture again, Russia, that we are collectively standing to defeat Russia. So that is something President Putin will never accept, and that's why he is also engaged in nuclear signaling also, that if he is pushed beyond a certain limit, there is a possibility of resumption of nuclear testing also, or building more weapons also. So that is going to lead to action-reaction phenomena, and that's going to be dangerous for the world.
So there are two parts of your take which I understand. The first relates to when the US wants Russia to be projected as a bad guy, that they just backtracked from this last major treaty that stood between them. Now, when we talk about US also withdrew from the INF and during the Trump administration, so how could a US build a case against Russia, projecting it as a bad guy, the only one who is backtracking from the treaty?
That's very interesting. It's not only the INF. US also withdrew from the
Treaty.
ABM treaty also, ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missile treaty, which Russia was interested in maintaining that, but US withdrew from that treaty also. So there's a track record. US had been doing similar kind of actions, but now the way the media is being controlled, and we don't see any of the statements of the news coming from the Russian side, mostly Western perspective that we hear, and that's how it is being projected that President Putin is probably the bad guy who withdrew from this treaty, and he is going to destabilize international security, and hence we need to stand together and build a coalition against, the coalition is already there, but urging other countries also, the reluctant partners also, that for your own security, since Russia has withdrawn from or they suspended this treaty, you should stand with us. I think it's going to be problematic for some of the reluctant NATO partners also now to maintain that semblance of neutrality. They will have to take certain position because they cannot support President Putin suspending this treaty. So United States in a way has strengthened that coalition against Russia by pushing President Putin to take a certain action.
So, of course, there was a concern which was raised from the European capitals at that time when the US withdrew from INF in particular. So, when you also mentioned that talks regarding this. So, we have seen the statement coming from the US Secretary of State saying, let me quote, "We remain ready to talk about the strategic arms limitations at any time with Russia, irrespective of anything else going on in the world or in our relationship." So can we understand that this statement depicts whether the Ukraine conflict goes on, US is still willing to talk to Russia regarding the arms control?
That's what US would want, to dehyphenate what is going on in Ukraine and talk arms control with Russia. But Russia doesn't want to dehyphenate that because what is happening in Ukraine, and it is the outcome of this whole action, Western-led, US-led actions against Russia. I'm not justifying Russian invasion or any sort, but Russia is a big power, and if you provoke a big power, and President Putin, so he was bound to take certain action. So I think it was more of reaction. So Russians, they want to hyphenate this with the Ukrainian conflict, that if you want to talk to us in future, you need to tone down your rhetoric in Ukraine. You need to demonstrate that whatever actions you are doing, you are not threatening Russian national security. And he is, by linking UK and France also, probably it's signaling that if you want to talk, and that's a bargaining kind of a thing, that they want to bring in, rope in UK and France also in that kind of negotiation. That is not going to happen. The worst thing is, eventually both sides stop talking to each other, the treaty might expire, or any of the party may like to terminate just for signaling. But there is still hope. If United States Secretary of State is ready, I think they should also be realistic that Russia wouldn't talk to them without discussing what is going on in Ukraine. So they have to take that into context.
So, Mr. Naqvi, how do you see this particular statement by the U.S. Secretary of State that we are ready to talk on the limitations regarding the arms, the strategic arms at any time with Russia, irrespective of our relationship or whatever is happening in the world?
Well, you see, this is all rhetoric and meant to or aimed at giving an impression that they are doing the right thing, which is not correct. You see, the whole Ukraine crisis developed because the United States and the NATO countries decided to encircle Russia. And they started sort of hinting that all the countries surrounding Russia will be brought into NATO, especially Ukraine. And that the Russians thought was a provocation, and it was almost a step towards aggression against Russia. And as just now said by my friend Adil, that Russia is a big power, and Russia has its security concerns, and that has to be taken into account. But the United States has been provoking the Russians since quite some time, and the Russians will, that is why Putin said in his speech that this war against Ukraine was actually provoked by the NATO countries. So, you know, this kind of behavior by the United States has led to this kind of crisis. And then the Secretary of State says he's ready for talks. I mean, who is he trying to fool? And this is totally a kind of assertion which belies all their behavior. There is no synchronization between what they are doing and what they are saying. Now, this breakdown is worrisome because it has implications for the security, international security, the security of the entire globe. Because if there is resort to nuclear weapons or even fresh testing and further progress towards acquisition of more arms, nuclear arms, this is not only dangerous, but it is also going against what the technological trend is, because emerging technologies are now going towards artificial intelligence, towards cyber use, and towards more modern approaches in regard to military offensives and actions. So it was hoped by experts that now the nuclear issue will go into the background, but it has again come into the forefront, and that is very worrying, because nuclear arms have the potential of destroying much of life. I mean, it will create a cloud over the globe which will block sunshine and which will kill all agriculture, and it will also deform and destroy life. So nobody in his sane mind would want this to happen, and that is why mutually assured destruction was called MAD, because it is mad. It is how can you just aim at it is like the Aesop's tale that a snake was bothered by a fly that was hovering around it. So the snake decided to put its head under a carriage wheel which was passing by and got crushed. So I mean, this is I think virtually a mad idea, and the world should avoid any nuclear confrontation.
Right. Mr. Vereycken, how serious do you think the U.S. seems to be when the U.S. Secretary of State says that we remain ready to talk with Russia, irrespective of our relationship with them or whatever is going on in the world?
No, I think it's an error to overemphasize and fixate too much on Ukraine. The global picture is that the real strategic challenge for the Anglo-American and the dollar system is China. And it has been said by some geopoliticians in the US that the Ukraine war is only a warm-up. Now, there is a study of the RAND Corporation close to the Pentagon, which says the US should not go into a long war in Ukraine because we have to prepare for a war on China. Now, since Madrid, NATO has become a global aggressive organization, which is now a global NATO. We see it's working with Japan for mutual exchange. They're arming also Australia. So the big game is to go for a war on China. And of course, they don't want a nuclear war with Russia. They just want to bleed down the Russians as much as possible. And then that's my conviction. Prepare to move into the big game, which would be to take out China. And that's therefore it's normal. And I mean, the fact that Putin is reminding people that Russia is a nuclear power and that these treaties should not be an excuse for allowing conventional wars in the way this horrible war is unfolding in Ukraine. It is a wake-up call to really get out of this paradigm, and the West should accept that they are not any longer the colonial powers dictating the rules-based order. The world has changed in that we have to sit down, cool down, and rebuild a new paradigm of peace and mutual development.
Right, Mr. Vereycken, when we have seen a couple of statements after this suspension, the Kremlin spokesperson says the West will need to show willingness to take into account our concerns. So at what fronts do you think the Western countries should show their willingness to consider Russia's concern seriously?
Well, the solution for Ukraine is known for everybody. You know, the principle is that there is a notion of indivisible security. The security of the West is dependent of the security of Russia. Russia has already given up on the moment of the reunification in 91. They gave up, they moved out of Germany. Today we should create a neutral state. There can be still referendum in the Donbass and the southern parts of Ukraine. Ukraine should never, it would be sufficient for if Biden would take up the phone and tell Zelensky that Ukraine will never become a member of NATO. This would be sufficient, and this has been tried by Turkey and by Israel. There were agreements and negotiations, and the Ukrainian part, they were accepting this perspective of a neutral Ukraine in a new international relation of mutual development. And it has been sabotaged by people like Boris Johnson. It's now all proven that there is a war party and that the problem is not Ukraine and Russia. The problem is the military-industrial complex and the way they see their own financial bankruptcy and strategic weakness, and that they want to go for a war provocation. And we have to get millions of people in the street to mobilize to stop this war.
Right, Mr. Vereycken, why makes the US so interested to get the Ukraine in NATO's fold? And we have seen a statement coming from President Putin a couple of days before that the West, the Russians are locked in an existential threat with the West, and the West wants to carve up Russia to steal its vast natural resources.
Well, it can be seen by the fact that Zelensky has already met people like Larry Fink of BlackRock, which want to make Ukraine a so-called a model of Western capitalism. And this is a bad joke. I mean, because if you look in terms of real economy, of physical infrastructure, of living standards, you know, the living standards of the US population today is lower than it was 20 years ago. So this is a dying system, and they don't care about. I mean, they don't care about Ukraine. The security of Ukraine is not to be part of NATO or not of NATO. And secondly, it is a complete lie and a fraud that Russia is now back willing to try to build a communist world empire or something. I mean, Russia has been very patient since the Maidan, since the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the war which started in 2014, where Kiev started bombing its own population. For 8 years, Russia has not reacted to intervene directly, while the Russian-speaking populations in the Donbass were at least 14,000 people killed. And so I don't say it's good. I don't like wars, and I don't say it's normal to violate borders, but there is some kind of legitimate defense of the right to protect these populations, and the right, normally, it's even in Article 1 of NATO, is that all conflicts should first be resolved by mutual discussion, and this never applied. So the West is, NATO has violated its own charter and should be disbanded. It's only in charge of trying to manage the conflict it has created itself, and it's not the U.S. even. It's a global financial oligarchy which is running a dollar-based system, and they don't care about Ukraine or about the American population. They care about controlling financial interests. They're ready to reduce the world population. They're going for nuclear brinkmanship. They're ready to go to the utter limit of a nuclear confrontation. Then they believe that by some fantasy that they will be able to impose their rule. And I think that's very dangerous for all of us.
Right, Dr. Sultan, as Mr. Vereycken has said that NATO should be disbanded, it has violated its own charter. What makes the NATO countries and the US and its Western allies so much interested to take Ukraine into its fold? What's your take regarding that?
It's the sense of insecurity which has ingrained over a period of time where United States and some of the influential Western countries have been building up this bogey that if NATO doesn't stay together or if it doesn't spend more on defense, probably Russia or China, or for that matter, are going to harm their national security interests. Now it is up to NATO countries. So they had been with the United States and they feel insecure that in case there's no US guarantees or if they're out of NATO, probably that insecurity is there. But these NATO countries have to see for themselves at what price they are still a part of the NATO, because if arms race starts globally, Europe is going to be the most affected, most vulnerable and most insecure region. So these countries who were spending very less, and President Trump during his tenure had been asking that Germany and other countries need to cough up more money for the security guarantees that we are paying. The kind of situation Germany and some of the countries are, the economy is going down and they are feeling the heat of this war. They have to see the repercussions of such actions where United States just for own its prestige or just to declare a victory, a symbolic victory against Russia. US is sacrificing Ukraine also, and US is ready to sacrifice much of the European continent just to prove that, because that mentality of post-Cold War, that has come back, where United States wants to be recognized the only superpower, sole superpower, and who can define and guide the international rules. Russia doesn't accept that. China doesn't accept that. The United States has to realize that whatever happened, this is not China or Russia. They're not going to accept US hegemony in this. But these actions are going to create insecurity not only in that part of the world, but at the global level, in our region also, because the countries who want to be very closely associated or seen as US strategic partner, they would be building justifications to build more arms against China and seeking more help from the United States and other Western countries. And this in turn would put more pressure on countries like Pakistan also. So I think that's how I see these developments evolving. It's not about new start, it's the mentality of the US military-industrial complex also, and also the US leadership, current leadership. President Biden is not strong president, unlike President Obama. President Obama could take certain initiative, and that is how New Start happened. Trump had a different philosophy. Biden is mostly swayed by the opinion of the Congress or the push by the military-industrial complex, and that is how we see him landing in Ukraine one fine morning. But he doesn't have a vision to see the repercussions of this arms race, that yes, military-industrial complex would thrive, but at what cost? At the cost of global security. I think that's where we need to be more concerned.
So do we understand that these are the failed policies on the face of it by President Biden?
Absolutely.
And he has no vision of seeing through and having that understanding of the repercussions of whatever he's doing, and along with his Western allies.
Absolutely. If you see what is happening, Ukraine has been destroyed. Europe is under threat. There's serious economic crisis. Many of the European countries, they are struggling to survive. And this is going to deteriorate in the future also. It is not going to improve with this more arms race, and with this posture, more emboldened posture by United States, encouraging, inciting other European countries to chip in more money, to give more armaments, to join or strengthen their position. This is not going to help anyone in that region also, and globally also.
So do we see the world heading towards a very clear-cut divide between East and the West?
I wouldn't say East and the West. I think we thought it is going to be multipolar, where major powers would have some dominance. It would be kind of a democratic culture, but I think it's we can't see as a black and white. The way things are evolving, we don't know. Chinese would be very much interested not to see Russia being symbolically defeated, because they know after Russia, it's their turn. It's going to be their turn, and it very publicly, vocally, U.S. Administration, the policymakers had been saying that China is a major adversary. So China would be very much interested how this confrontation evolved, and they might play some role in that part. And hopefully, if they do
But
some
the kind of the statement that came from U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Antony Blinken, regarding China contemplating of providing the lethal assistance to Russia in the Ukraine conflict, and there was a very strong worded reaction from Mr. Wang Yi also, and we have seen Mr. Wang Yi having a meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin as well as Mr. Sergei Lavrov. So quite a warmth that was visible in those meetings also, and kind of a statement by Russian President that no other country can influence the Sino-Russia relations.
Absolutely. If you see, this has always been the trend. They start to build certain narrative, perceptions, and they might say that China and Russia are forging an alliance, military alliance. And earlier, if they were talking about China being the major adversary, you might see in the next national security strategy that it's a joint Russia-China alliance that we need to work. So hence, building a justification for more military spending. So that's how it has been, because they start a narrative, they provide justifications, and then they completely neglect what actions may have prompted the other side in reacting.
Please go ahead.
No,
Complete your thought, please. Mr. Naqvi, as Dr. Sultan has just mentioned, that President Biden happens to be much weaker a president as compared to Barack Obama and Mr. Trump. Now, with his failed policies, of course, there is an imminent conflict going on. It has serious repercussions. There has been destruction and damage in Ukraine, loss in men and material also. Long-term repercussions of these failed policies. Your take.
Well, Biden or Trump or Obama are important, of course, but the broader issue is something totally different. That is the mindset. You know, I'll tell you a very small story very quickly. I was in London a few years ago, and I have a friend in there who was in the House of Lords, a lady Olga Maitland. And I called her to meet her, and she said that, why don't you come over for dinner tonight, because we have a discussion group of retired diplomats, admirals, generals and whatever have you, academics. And a professor of the London School of Economics is going to be speaking, after which there will be a discussion. He will speak about the Russian threat to NATO. So, you know, that made my ears in Urdu as a kaan khade hue. So I said, why is this being considered? She said, well, that is a reality. So I said, look, she invited me for the dinner. I said, I will come to your dinner, but only if you allow me to say a few words. She said, fine, of course, you are a guest. And I said, as an Asian, to me, there is no Russian threat to NATO. In fact, it is the NATO threat to Russia. So there are two different perspectives, and I elaborated upon it, which I don't want to go into, but there are two different perspectives. And in that context, of course, there is also China. So whatever the US president, whoever the US president may be, as you asked about Biden, I think this mindset is such that they are hell-bent against each other. And that is very dangerous for the world at large.
So, Mr. Naqvi, the kind of statement your Secretary of State regarding China's contemplating providing Russia with lethal assistance vis-a-vis Ukraine conflict, is it a direct attempt to drag China also into Ukraine conflict? Because China has refrained from condemning that special military operation, as Russians say it, since it started.
Yeah, I think China and Russia, there was a US security document from the time of Bush till about 2018 or so. The stance of the US defense establishment was that the biggest danger to the world is terrorism. And then therefore there was the war on terrorism, etc. But in 2018, I think, the national security document for the first time named Russia and China as the biggest threat to security, world security. So yes, US is trying to pull in China into a situation where they can say that China is also a threat. China refuses to be treated like that. China talks of win-win cooperation, working together, and all these things. So I think the US is baiting, as they say, baiting China to get involved, and then it can use that pretext to also
so don't you think two major powers in this particular region, China and Russia, if go joining hands on all the fronts, that would become even more challenging, not only for the US, but also for the Western allies of it?
Yes, I think that is the danger, the confrontation that might result from this kind of lineup, US and the Western countries, and China and Russia. And that is not good for the world at large, because we here in South Asia and in other places, we will also suffer the consequences of this kind of confrontation.
Right. Mr. Vereycken, there was a concern, which was a warning which was raised by Russians that they think that Ukraine might be staging a false flag nuclear incident by deploying a dirty bomb. How serious that threat is, and if Ukraine goes on to do that, so what sort of tit-for-tat measures or a reaction from Russian side could be expected?
Well, I think this was somehow on the table a couple of some time ago, but it's becoming unlikely because the Ukrainian army is in a very, very bad shape. Now, if you look to the statistics which were published in a Turkish newspaper by the figures by the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence services, are completely different than the official narrative, and show that, I mean, the Russians are grinding down now one by one all the new weapons who arrived, and there is a very, very big problem for manpower for the Ukrainian army. And very, very soon, this narrative is going to hit the wall of reality, and there will be a lot of rhetoric, and they will have to find a way to explain why they have been lying for the last 6 months about this whole thing. So we can't know. It's difficult to know. Of course, I think starting a war is easy, and ending a war can be much dangerous, and it's very difficult. And especially if people have been lying about the situation, any irrational. There could be operations in Moldavia. There could be things happening in Poland. There have been already drone attacks of Ukraine on Russian airfields against airplanes which were not having nuclear weapons, but which could have carried them. Uh, there are there are some people on the ground, including American and NATO forces, which are trying to keep all this somehow under control. They want this conflict, but they want it in a controlled fashion and up to a certain level. They don't want this to go completely out of control because they have a longer vision, and but it is a completely powder keg which can completely go out of control. That's for sure.
Right, Mr. Karel Vereycken, political analyst, joining us from Paris, France, associated with the Schiller Institute. Thank you very much for your time, for being with us tonight on Views on News. I really appreciate that. In the studio, we were joined by Dr. Adil Sultan, Dean and the head of the Department of the Strategic Studies at University. Dr. Sultan, thank you very much for your time, also being with us. And Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi, former permanent representative to International Atomic Energy Agency. Thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And with that, we come to the end of today's show. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.